So I'm really pleased to give you some insights from our ongoing research project across JLL Asia Pacific on this topic. So first of all, a big part of my role as the head of research for our corporate business in the region is thinking about the future of the workplace and what it looks like, right? Are we moving from the model on the left, with the very static, cubicle-based working, to something more on the right, which is what we typically think of when we think of a co-working space or a flexible office, which is very comfortable, almost like a residential space, sofas with natural light, with nice coffee and all of that. Is that, what is the future? Is the future of the workplace flexible? And what does that mean for all of us working in this industry, whether we are developers, whether we're owners, managers, occupiers of the property? What does this really mean? So when we talk about flexible space, the first thing that people say is like, oh, that's really synonymous with co-working. And then they often think of WeWork, which is kind of the flag bearer for this industry across the world, and even just by name alone has really kind of built the market in a lot of ways. But it's not just that. When we do our research, we think about flexible space much more broadly than that. It's really about any kind of space that does not require a long-term commitment or lease. And that could mean co-working, WeWork, could mean Regis, Executive Center, all the traditional serviced office providers that have been around for many years. And any other type of flexible lease structures that are now coming into play. So it's really any type of short-term commitment space. This could be occupied by startups, freelancers with a natural native market. We're increasingly seeing interest, and kind of the providers are targeting larger enterprises, which in my role is something that's very interesting, how that's affecting the market. So this is just to give you some context of how we're thinking about it. We also say it's far more than comfortable sofas and free beer, because that's what you often hear about with some of the co-working spaces. It's really just having flexibility and low commitment. So as I was mentioning, we think about WeWork, we also think about Regis. Really, some of my old-timer colleagues are always saying, oh, I've seen this before. A lot of, flexible space has been around for a long time. It's just been known as serviced offices. What's new is kind of, kind of the more aesthetic and feel of the co-working space. But, like it or not, however you view it, co-working has really taken flexible space into the stratosphere, as we would say. I would say that it's kind of got a very, very strong tailwind from the tech boom, the emergence of a number of startups in cities around the world, the emergence of freelancing and the gig economy. All of this is it's hit the sweet spot in terms of the larger macro trends to really boost boost its profile and boost flexible space overall. It's really brought flexible space into the mainstream. And as I said before, it's really brought it into the mainstream conversations. It's not just a real estate conversation, it's really something that everyone is interested in. And now WeWork is, as you know, one of these tech unicorns, so many, many companies are really hoping to follow suit. On the left-hand side, you'll see some of the statistics, quite current, from DeskMag, which does pretty comprehensive, one of the most comprehensive surveys of co-working and flex space. 5.1 million members by 2022, 30,000 locations, and these numbers just keep getting rise higher and higher every year. So on this basis, because this is exploding, particularly more recently, just in the last 1 to 2 years in Asia Pacific, those of us on the research team across Asia Pacific covering leasing on the corporate side, we launched an ongoing research project to really understand the supply of flexible space in key markets across the region. We're now covering 18 markets. And also to understand the demand. What is this looking like and how it's evolving, particularly for larger companies who are starting to explore this. So we're continuing to do this. We also have involved people across all business lines across JLL and external partners. So leasing specialists in all of our markets, some in our corporate business, facilities management, anyone who's kind of client-facing with corporates. We've talked to operators, we've talked to all sorts of brokers who are very focused on the space to really develop a full picture of what this is looking like and and how it's evolving. So a few of our key findings. The first one is that the area leased by major flexible space operators in these 18 markets has tripled from 2014 to the end of Q1 this year. A note about our methodology, we have focused just to set some clear boundaries around the market, to look at the biggest and highest profile markets, providers in all of the markets we're looking at. So we've taken a somewhat conservative view, but it's still showing that this has tripled in basically 3 in the big years. The total stock of these major operators increased to about 2 million square meters across the 18 markets through the end of Q1. And 11 of the 18 cities in Asia Pacific that we have assessed, they have recorded flexible space growth in excess of 100%, so they've essentially doubled from 2014 to Q1 this year. The area leased by the operators in terms of its relationship to gross leasing volumes in these markets, it's about 8%. So that varies a bit across markets. It's not it's kind of a rough measure, but it shows that it is a small but significant part of leasing activity. I know that in some parts of this region, it's much higher than that from talking to our leasing colleagues. And then this is a quite controversial finding, but we do think it's accurate. This is JLL Research, actually worldwide, has made this prediction, which is that flexible space, in one form or another, whether it's external space, flexible space, concepts within existing offices, flexible lease structures, it could comprise about 30% of commercial property portfolios by 2030. When you first heard this prediction, a lot of people are like, wow, there's no way. But when you think about the range of flexible options, and when you see, as I have through conversations with clients around the world and in the region, it's possible. It's definitely possible. The interest is there. So just a deep dive in some of our statistics. So we have been really closely connected with our research colleagues around the world who are doing similar exercises on assessing the flexible space market. As you can see here, Asia Pacific is leading the world in growth. Perhaps unsurprising, we kind of started a little bit later, particularly the co-working boom that's really boosted this. So, for example, WeWork launched in 2010 in the US, so that market is a little bit more mature. It's really, the growth is really in secondary markets. But Asia Pacific was really only about 2015 or so that it really started to pick up in this region with some, particularly in China. So we're leading the world in the growth of space. Just a little bit more specifically on how it has grown since 2014. Pretty phenomenal, 650,000 square meters of 2014, and then Q1 2018, it's almost 2 million square meters. And again, these are the major operators. In a lot of the markets we've looked at, there's a very long tail of very small operators. I'm sure you're probably familiar with those here in Ho Chi Minh City and other places, but it's still pretty phenomenal how much it's grown and how big this market is. In terms of the individual markets, the flexible space stock is the highest. These are the 18 markets we've looked at in probably, again, unsurprisingly, given the size of them altogether, in India and China, right? So Beijing and Shanghai are the biggest, Bangalore in India, as well as Delhi. But actually Tokyo, interestingly, is in the top 5 cities in terms of flexible space stock. That's really exploded in the past year or so. WeWork, one of their big investors, is SoftBank, which is based in Japan. And they've opened at least 6 very large centers in Tokyo just in the past 6 months. So it's a huge market for them. Another way of looking at this is to look at the proportion of, to look at the flexible space stock in relation to grade A stock. I think this market in Ho Chi Minh City is quite an outlier, as we see here, but that's primarily driven by, as we've seen in Stephen's presentation, relatively small grade A stock. So this is kind of a rough ratio of flexible stock to grade A stock. We also need to keep in mind that a lot of the flexible space operators are in kind of grade B or other asset classes. They're in retail space or other spaces. So, but on an average, average, across the region, the 18 markets, it's about 2.1%, the ratio of flexible space to grade A stock. As a result, it hasn't had a huge impact on the movement of some of the fundamentals of the market, but it is, it's small and it's growing as we'll see. Another key finding of our research is the huge fragmentation of the market, right? So this is just a few. This is Tokyo, Shanghai, Singapore, and Hong Kong. Just a few examples of some of the local players that are prominent, and then we have a few international and regional players. WeWork, Naked Hub, which was acquired by WeWork in the last 6 months. So we'll see, it's just very large fragmentation, a few big local and regional players, and then a long tail of small players. But this is kind of a big risk for players in the market, is that as it grows, there's low barriers to entry. Really differentiating themselves is a key to success in the market, and what that means is very important. So something we've also looked at quite closely is the emergence of larger enterprises and corporates as a source of demand and as a target for the operators, right? This has been discussed a lot in the press with relation to WeWork particularly. So we found really there's a growing convergence between service office operators who have traditionally serviced the corporate market and the co-working providers who've traditionally serviced the freelancers and entrepreneurs in terms of targeting larger companies. So service office operators are trying to become more co-working-like, to provide the kind of that more casual and collaborative feel. At the same time, WeWork and other co-working providers are, they're very vocally targeting larger companies. They're moving in from kind of smaller, quirkier spaces to central location, large locations in centrally located large floor plate buildings. You might not know it, but you think of co-working, you think of these types of spaces as kind of being very open plan, lots of little desks. But actually 50 to 80% of all flexible space locations are actually enclosed offices of various sizes. And that's something that corporates really want. They want to preserve the confidentiality, the privacy, and kind of the team culture of their organizations within this external space. So they're all converging. They're all trying to be like each other, and they're all trying to cater to bigger companies. At the same time, if we look at the demand side, from the interviews that myself and my colleagues have done with almost 30 different clients of JLL across the world and in Asia Pacific, there's a lot of interest in this. Everybody wants to explore it. They see a lot of opportunities. They see all the entrepreneurs and the people that are already sitting in these places, and they're saying, we want to capture that. We want our people to be inspired. They see a lot of potential in generating innovation by sitting in a more collaborative and open space. They see opportunities for improving the optimization of their portfolios, saving costs, just having that flexibility, particularly in smaller markets or new emerging markets like this one, where they're kind of want to have a platform to expand further, and they want to have a platform for expanding headcount as needed. So there's a lot of interest in it, but there's a lot of barriers. Like I said, the IT, confidentiality, what does this all mean? But we found that, so right now, less than 5% of corporate portfolios, the clients we talk to, are actually comprised of flexible space. There are a few that said, yeah, it could be more than 10% in the next 3 to 5 years. But I do think, we mentioned earlier the 30% of corporate portfolios will be flex space by 2030. We put that out there, and that, that said, well, a lot of them said, well, that's possible. We just have to overcome some of these issues that we have with it. It's more likely, in my view, that all spaces, all offices, all workplaces become more flexible in their design and how people use them. I think that's more likely than big companies moving lots of people into external spaces. But I think the point is that companies are interested, and the external flex space providers are really trying to capture that. WeWork is continually trying to optimize their offer to, based on the feedback they're getting from corporates. I keep getting a lot of a lot of information from my colleagues in the US who have a lot of face time with them, and they're really, really actively trying to tweak what they're offering to really attract good companies. And here's some of the examples of companies in Asia Pacific that are using some quantity of flex space. So just to deep dive a little bit on the local market here in Ho Chi Minh City. So we found that as of Q1 this year, there was about 33,000 square meters of flexible space across major operators. Again, I'll just reiterate our methodology. We found that the penetration, as you saw on the earlier slide, was about 13.4%, because of the relatively small total stock of grade A space. We've also found that, that the growth was about a little over 100% for the last few years. And we foresee that growing even more. We understand that there's been a lot of growth and acceleration in growth just in the last year or so. We looked at about 25 high-profile operators. That's quite a lot, right? We found in some cities there could be, we assessed maybe the top 10, but there could be, in Singapore, there's about 70. So as I said, it's a very fragmented marketplace. We really foresee the big international operators such as WeWork to be entering the market soon. Just some of the big trends. Again, acceleration of the space since 2017 in the past year or so. We found that some of the local operators are moving into retail space, non-office space, and that's something we've seen in a lot of markets actually in the region. Demand is coming from startups, as I said, companies, new entrants to the market, looking for a platform for expansion, kind of flexibility and temporary space to accommodate, unanticipated changes in headcount. A lot of the trends that we've really seen in other markets. So it's not unusual in terms of the growth of the supply, in terms of the operator landscape, in terms of where the demand is coming from. The bottom point is an important one, and I'll explore that in a bit because that's something that's a very strong trend in Asia Pacific, which is the government support for entrepreneurship, emergence of startups. That is a huge driver for demand, and we predict that that will persist in this market going forward. So one thing, just to move on and kind of blow out again and talk about Asia Pacific more broadly, something that we explored in our research is, we've seen how flexible space has evolved in the US and in Europe, and it's kind of really taking off now in Asia Pacific. Might it evolve differently here than the other regions? We think there are a few reasons that it might. The first one, as I was just pointing out and talking about Ho Chi Minh City, is that government interventions are quite important in terms of both the supply and the demand side. So across Asia Pacific, not just here in Vietnam, but in Singapore, in China particularly, huge government support for entrepreneurship creates startups which are a natural source of demand, smaller companies for flexible space. Some government agencies, again in Singapore, we have something called the Launchpad, the government of New South Wales in Australia, other government entities in other parts of the region are actually developing their own flexible space concepts. So the governments are quite involved, and that's a little bit different than what we've seen in other places. More powerful landlords. Landlords have a lot more of a role in Asia Pacific than other places, and that could really determine the shape and where these players are located and their expansion plans. So for example, in Singapore, the top 15 landlords control 75% of the office space in the central business district. Whereas if you look at New York City, the top 10 landlords have about less than 20%. So that creates a lot of a different platform for expansion, where the landlords have a bigger role in how the operators evolve. Shorter standard lease terms in the US, UK, leases are typically like 10 years plus. So having a shorter commitment, it's a no-brainer for some companies. That's a really great opportunity. Whereas here, shorter lease terms, not everywhere, Japan and Australia being notable exceptions, there's shorter lease terms. So that opportunity is not as, that driver is not as strong. We also see a lot of flexibility among landlords in Asia Pacific. So that could have some impact and relevance. And finally, a little bit more of a kind of softer one, which is that, if we're thinking about bigger companies moving people or adopting flexible concepts, In many parts of Asia, the corporate culture is quite hierarchical. Space is quite associated with someone's status in the company. This is kind of at odds with the kind of very open and non-hierarchical sort of way that the flexible space is set up and how people use it. But that clearly hasn't stopped the evolution and the growth of the space so far. It just means a bit more of a leap, particularly for bigger companies or for kind of more well-established companies to adopt these concepts. So looking forward, what does this all mean? We're continuing to do research on this topic. We're planning to do some deep dives, a little bit more of a deeper analysis on the relevance for investors. What does it mean to have a huge proportion of your portfolio and a significant chunk of your tenants like co-working operators or flexible space operators? We'll be doing some more about occupiers. We'll be doing some more about operators themselves and trying to develop some insights that are meaningful for them. But just some general trends in the near future. First, for landlords, we believe that flexible space offerings are going to become an essential amenity in any new development or even an existing one. We know that the Paya quarter in Singapore, they have earmarked, I think it's about 10% of the space, this is a new development launching next year, I believe, to flexible space, to co-working space. So it's just going to be like having a coffee shop or having a restaurant, having some F&B in the development. You really need to have some kind of flexible office space. Secondly, landlord-driven models. This is really coming to play heavily in Singapore. Landlords are partnering with co-working players. They're partnering with service offices to develop other concepts. They're really seeking to get involved and capture value from the market. Another thing to think about is that other asset classes. I just read an article the other day about how restaurants are trying to monetize their space in downtimes by renting out the desks. Similarly, hotels are getting in on the act and doing that too. So this is even beyond offices. There are opportunities for the owners of spaces to really capture the value of this market. Finally, tenant demands and expectations around flexibility. We really think that there's kind of a fundamental, perhaps permanent shift in how companies think about offices, and there will be increased demands for flexibility in terms of lease terms, in terms of the spaces themselves, in terms of the fit outs. For occupiers, for corporates, just to reiterate what I mentioned before, it's still really early days. Many companies are still piloting it, they're trialing, using particularly external flex space with small teams, sales teams, particularly marketing. But there's really intense appetite and interest in flex space. Beyond the economics, cost is one element, but there are a lot of other elements that are driving interest. As I mentioned before, there's the community, there's the innovation, the idea that being exposed to different types of people or working in collaborative ways will enhance innovation. Building communities, that's something that companies like WeWork have seen is doing really well, and that's a key component in driving a better experience in the workplace, which is a trend we're seeing everywhere, right? Because the workplace is continually and increasingly being seen as a way to attract and retain talent in a very tight market. And it's just a good way to make people happy. By learning lessons, this point is what I mentioned before, which is beyond thinking about WeWork or Regis or Naked Hub or any of these companies. It's really that corporates of all sizes are looking at them and saying, what can we learn from the way they use their spaces, the way they activate it, what happens there, how people work together, and how can we bring that into our own workplaces, to make people better, happier, more productive, and benefit the enterprise overall. And then operators. I don't know if we have any operators of flexible space in this room, but the first is this distinctiveness, the differentiation point. This market is growing fast, there's low barriers to entry, huge numbers of small companies entering, and with the advent of WeWork, and WeWork specifically targeting Southeast Asia as one of their growth markets, they'll be coming soon, and gobbling up gobbling up space. You know, operators of this, they need to think about how they differentiate themselves, bottom line. Delivering on the promise of community and services. You know, the community aspect is something, as I said, is very attractive. The services, the technology enablement of the spaces, they really need to be able to deliver on that. I've heard from some clients in some parts of the world that some operators who shall remain nameless, they kind of say they can do a lot in terms of technology and they can't really deliver on it, and that's really important. And then pursuing partnership opportunities, which with landlords and with other partners in terms of their service providers, because that's a way to get a leg up in this very competitive marketplace. So it's a lot, but that's it for the moment. Keep an eye out. JLL will be continuing to publish research on this topic. We're gathering data and we're developing a database on flex space market in Ho Chi Minh City and 17 other markets in the region. And you know, we'll be continuing to explore it as it's such a high priority for us and all of our clients. So thank you very much for your time.